The Widow's Wicked Warning, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with a warning, quiet, unsettling, and far too specific to ignore. It came from a widow long known in the village for her sharp tongue and watchful eyes, a woman most dismissed as bitter, until her words began to come true. At first, her warning seemed like nothing more than suspicion, a passing remark, a hint of unease. But when events unfold exactly as she described, the villagers can no longer laugh it away. Miss Marple, however, sees something deeper, the careful choice of words, the timing of the warning, and the unsettling possibility that the widow knew far more than she ever revealed. Because warnings are rarely given without reason, and sometimes they are meant to conceal as much as they reveal. Before we uncover the truth behind the widow's wicked warning, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales.
Chapter 1. The Widow's First Warning. The village of St. Alderwick had always been the sort of place where nothing truly happened, and yet, somehow, everything was quietly observed. It rested beneath a wide, pale sky, where clouds moved slowly and without urgency, and the hedges were clipped so neatly that they seemed almost unnatural. The lanes were narrow, the gardens carefully kept, and the houses stood with a quiet dignity that suggested nothing within them could ever truly go wrong. And yet, in villages such as this, it was often the smallest disturbance that carried the greatest consequence. Miss Marple had long held the belief that human nature did not change, no matter how peaceful the setting appeared. It was a principle she had observed time and again, and one she rarely found to be incorrect. So when the matter of the widow was first brought to her attention, she did not dismiss it, as others had done, with a light laugh or a shrug of indifference. Instead, she listened. It was Mrs. Ellison who spoke of it, leaning forward in her chair with the kind of urgency that suggested more than idle gossip. The afternoon had been calm, the sort of quiet that encouraged long conversations, and yet there was something in her tone that unsettled the stillness. "You must not think it is simply talk," Mrs. Ellison said, her voice careful but edged with unease. "The woman gave him a warning, a very clear one." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. She did not interrupt. She had learned that people often revealed more when they were allowed to continue uninterrupted. "A warning," she repeated softly. "And who was it that received this warning?" "Mr. Harold Finch," Mrs. Ellison replied, lowering her voice slightly, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "Just 2 days before he died." The name was familiar enough. Harold Finch had been a man of moderate means, well regarded, if not particularly loved. He had lived quietly, kept his affairs in order, and given no reason for suspicion. His death had been sudden, certainly, but not entirely unexpected for a man of his age. Miss Marple's knitting rested still in her lap as she considered this. "And what form did this warning take?" she asked gently. Mrs. Ellison hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around the arm of her chair. "She told him that the past does not stay buried and that he should prepare himself," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a silence that followed, deep and uneasy. Even the faint ticking of the clock seemed to press against it. Miss Marple's gaze shifted toward the window, though her thoughts were clearly elsewhere. "And Mr. Finch died shortly after," she said, her tone calm but precise. "Yes," Mrs. Ellison replied, "quite suddenly.
The doctor said it was his heart, but I cannot help but feel there was more to it than that." Miss Marple did not immediately agree, nor did she dismiss the idea. Instead, she allowed the thought to settle. "And this widow," she said after a moment, "who is she?" At this, Mrs. Ellison's expression changed, and not for the better. "She calls herself Mrs. Blackwood, though no one seems to know very much about her. She arrived only a few months ago, took the old hawthorn cottage at the edge of the village, and keeps very much to herself." "Does she receive visitors?" "Not that anyone has seen," Mrs. Ellison replied. "She walks occasionally, always at dusk, and when she does, people say she watches them, as though she knows something they do not." Miss Marple gave a faint, thoughtful nod. "People often imagine knowledge where there is only observation," she said quietly. But even as she spoke, there was a subtle narrowing of her eyes, a small indication that her mind had begun to turn. The conversation might have ended there, dismissed as one of those peculiar village tales that faded with time, had it not been for what happened the following morning. Miss Marple had set out early, taking her usual path along the narrow lane that led towards the outskirts of St. Alderwick. The air was cool, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. It was the kind of morning that encouraged quiet reflection, and she walked slowly, her thoughts returning again and again to the matter of the widow. It was then that she saw her. Mrs. Blackwood stood at the far end of the lane, near the turning that led towards Hawthorne Cottage. She was dressed entirely in dark clothing, though not in the manner of formal mourning. There was something deliberate about it, something chosen rather than required. Her posture was straight, her movements measured, and her presence seemed to carry a weight that did not belong to the peaceful surroundings. Miss Marple slowed her steps, not out of fear, but out of curiosity. As she approached, Mrs. Blackwood turned her head, and their eyes met. It was not an unpleasant gaze, nor was it overtly hostile, and yet there was something in it that lingered, as though she had been expecting this very encounter. "Good morning," Miss Marple said, her tone polite, her manner composed. Mrs. Blackwood inclined her head slightly. "Good morning," she replied, her voice calm, controlled, and entirely without hesitation. For a brief moment neither woman spoke further. The silence was not awkward, but it was not entirely comfortable either. It carried with it a sense of something unspoken, something waiting just beyond the reach of ordinary conversation. "You are new to the village," Miss Marple said. "I am," Mrs. Blackwood replied. "And you find it agreeable?" A faint pause followed. "It is quiet," the widow said. There was something in the way she spoke the word that gave it an entirely different meaning. Miss Marple observed her carefully. "Quiet places," she said gently, "often have long memories." At this, Mrs. Blackwood's gaze sharpened just slightly. "Yes," she said, "they do." Another silence followed, heavier this time. Miss Marple's gaze shifted toward the window, though her thoughts were clearly elsewhere. "And Mr. Finch died shortly after," she said, her tone calm but precise. "Yes," Mrs. Ellison replied, "quite suddenly. The doctor said it was his heart, but I cannot help but feel there was more to it than that." Miss Marple did not immediately agree, nor did she dismiss the idea. Instead, she allowed the thought to settle. "And this widow," she said after a moment, "who is she?" At this, Mrs. Ellison's expression changed, and not for the better. "She calls herself Mrs. Blackwood, though no one seems to know very much about her. She arrived only a few months ago, took the old hawthorn cottage at the edge of the village, and keeps very much to herself." "Does she receive visitors?" "Not that anyone has seen," Mrs. Ellison replied. "She walks occasionally, always at dusk, and when she does, people say she watches them, as though she knows something they do not." Miss Marple gave a faint, thoughtful nod. "People often imagine knowledge where there is only observation," she said quietly. But even as she spoke, there was a subtle narrowing of her eyes, a small indication that her mind had begun to turn. The conversation might have ended there, dismissed as one of those peculiar village tales that faded with time, had it not been for what happened the following morning. Miss Marple had set out early, taking her usual path along the narrow lane that led towards the outskirts of St. Alderwick. The air was cool, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. It was the kind of morning that encouraged quiet reflection, and she walked slowly, her thoughts returning again and again to the matter of the widow. It was then that she saw her. Mrs. Blackwood stood at the far end of the lane, near the turning that led towards Hawthorne Cottage. She was dressed entirely in dark clothing, though not in the manner of formal mourning. There was something deliberate about it, something chosen rather than required. Her posture was straight, her movements measured, and her presence seemed to carry a weight that did not belong to the peaceful surroundings. Miss Marple slowed her steps, not out of fear, but out of curiosity. As she approached, Mrs. Blackwood turned her head, and their eyes met. It was not an unpleasant gaze, nor was it overtly hostile, and yet there was something in it that lingered, as though she had been expecting this very encounter. "Good morning," Miss Marple said, her tone polite, her manner composed. Mrs. Blackwood inclined her head slightly. "Good morning," she replied, her voice calm, controlled, and entirely without hesitation. For a brief moment neither woman spoke further. The silence was not awkward, but it was not entirely comfortable either. It carried with it a sense of something unspoken, something waiting just beyond the reach of ordinary conversation. "You are new to the village, Miss—"
Chapter 2. The Widow's Second Warning. The days that followed did not return to normal, though the village made every effort to pretend that they had. Routine continued, as it always did in St. Alderwick, with its quiet habits and careful appearances, but beneath that calm surface there was a tension that had not been there before. It moved subtly, like a shadow that stretched just a little too far, or a silence that lasted just a second too long. Miss Marple, for her part, did not speak openly of her encounter with Mrs. Blackwood, yet she did not forget it either. The widow's words had not been vague in the way of ordinary superstition. They had carried intention, and more importantly, certainty. And certainty, Miss Marple knew, was rarely without reason. It was 3 days after that meeting when the second disturbance came. The news arrived just before noon, carried in hurried voices and uneasy expressions. Mr. Leonard Grayson had been found dead in his study. The discovery had been made by his housekeeper, who, upon receiving no answer to her repeated knocks, had entered the room to find him collapsed beside his desk. Once again, the doctor was quick to offer an explanation. A sudden failure of the heart, he said, nothing unusual given the man's age and condition. And once again, the explanation failed to settle the unease that spread through the village. Miss Marple listened quietly as the details were shared that afternoon. There was no dramatic scene, no sign of struggle, nothing that might suggest violence. Everything, on the surface, pointed toward a natural end. And yet, something did not sit quite right. "Did he complain of illness?" she asked gently as Mrs. Ellison recounted what little was known. "Not at all," Mrs. Ellison replied. "He was perfectly well the day before, spoke with several people, in fact. There was no indication that anything was wrong." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And had he, by any chance, encountered Mrs. Blackwood?" The question caused a visible shift in Mrs. Ellison's expression.
Yes, she said after a brief hesitation. Yes, he had. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. When? The evening before he died, Mrs. Ellison answered. Near the lane by the old churchyard. Several people saw them speaking together. There was no need to ask what had been said. Miss Marple already knew. Still, she asked, "And did she offer him a warning as well?" Mrs. Ellison swallowed. "She did," she said quietly, almost the same words. She told him that what had been hidden would not remain so, and that he should make peace while he still could. The room seemed to grow colder. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap, her expression composed, though her thoughts had begun to move with greater urgency. Two men, both dead within days of receiving a warning. Two deaths explained, perhaps too easily, as matters of the heart, and one woman, newly arrived, who spoke not in guesses, but in declarations. Coincidence was always possible, but repetition suggested something else. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple set out once more toward the edge of the village. Her pace was unhurried, but her purpose was clear. If there was truth to be found, it would not come from speculation alone. Hawthorne Cottage stood as it always had, slightly removed from the rest of the village, surrounded by overgrown hedges that had not yet been properly tamed. There was a stillness about it that felt different from the rest of St. Alderwick, not peaceful, but watchful. Miss Marple approached the gate and paused briefly before opening it. The hinges gave a soft, tired sound, and she made her way up the narrow path that led to the door. She had not yet raised her hand to knock when the door opened. Mrs. Blackwood stood there, as though she had been expecting her. "I wondered when you would come," the widow said. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Then I shall not pretend this is a surprise." Mrs. Blackwood stepped aside without another word, allowing her to enter. The interior of the cottage was simple, though not neglected. Everything was in its place, arranged with a precision that felt deliberate rather than comfortable. There were no unnecessary objects, no personal touches that might reveal anything of the woman who lived there. Miss Marple took this in quietly. "You have come about Mr. Grayson," Mrs. Blackwood said, closing the door behind them. "I have," Miss Marple replied. "And you believe I am responsible?" It was not a question. Miss Marple met her gaze calmly. "I believe," she said, "that you knew something before it happened." Mrs. Blackwood's expression did not change. "Yes," she said, "I did." There was no hesitation, no attempt to deny or deflect. Miss Marple felt a faint tightening in her chest, though her voice remained steady. "And how is it that you come by such knowledge?" Mrs. Blackwood moved toward the small table by the window and rested her hand upon it, her fingers still. "Because I have seen it before," she said. "In another place and at another time, the same pattern, the same kind of men." "And what kind is that?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Men who believe that what they have done will remain hidden, men who think that time is enough to erase what cannot be undone." Miss Marple's thoughts moved quickly. "And you believe that Mr. Finch and Mr. Grayson shared such a past?" "I do not believe it. I know it." The certainty in her voice was unmistakable. Miss Marple considered this carefully. And yet, she said, knowing something is not the same as causing it. A faint smile touched Mrs. Blackwood's lips. "No," she agreed, "it is not." There was a pause, and then Miss Marple spoke again. "You told them to prepare. Why?" Mrs. Blackwood's gaze did not waver. "Because they deserved to know," she said simply. Miss Marple studied her for a long moment. "Deserved," she repeated. "That is a strong word. It is an accurate one. Mrs. Blackwood replied. Silence settled between them, though it was no longer uncertain. It carried weight now and direction. Miss Marple took a slow breath. "And how many more are there?" she asked. For the first time, Mrs. Blackwood's expression shifted, though only slightly. "One," she said. The words seemed to echo in the small room. "One more man," she continued, "and then it will be finished." Miss Marple's grip on her walking stick tightened almost imperceptibly. "And who is this man?" Mrs. Blackwood held her gaze, and for a moment it seemed she might refuse to answer. Then, slowly, she spoke. "You already know him." Miss Marple's mind moved swiftly through the names and faces of the village, searching, connecting, questioning. "There are many men in St. Alderwick," she said carefully. "But only one," Mrs. Blackwood replied, "who shares their past." The meaning was clear. Miss Marple turned this over her mind, her thoughts aligning with a quiet, growing certainty. "And when will this final event occur?" Mrs. Blackwood stepped back slightly, her expression returning to that calm, unreadable state. "Soon," she said, "very soon." Miss Marple rose to her feet, her decision already forming. "Then I believe," she said, "that it would be wise to ensure that it does not." For the first time there was a flicker of something in Mrs. Blackwood's eyes, not fear, but something close to it. "You cannot prevent it." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "My dear Mrs. Blackwood," she replied softly, "I have found that most things can be prevented when one understands them properly." And with that, she turned and made her way toward the door. Behind her, Mrs. Blackwood did not move. "You are too late," she said quietly. "Perhaps, but I have rarely found that to be entirely true." She stepped outside, closing the door gently behind her. The air felt different now, heavier, as though the village itself were holding its breath. One more man, one more death if nothing was done. Miss Marple began her walk back with a renewed sense of purpose. The pieces were there, scattered but not beyond reach. A shared past, a hidden act, and a woman who knew far more than she should. The question was no longer whether something was wrong. It was what exactly had happened all those years ago, and who, among the living, was about to pay for it.
Chapter 3. The Widow's Final Warning. The village did not sleep easily that night. Though no one spoke of it openly, there was a quiet awareness that something remained unfinished. Doors were locked a little earlier than usual, curtains drawn a little tighter, and conversations ended with a hesitation that had not existed before. The air itself seemed to carry a warning, unspoken yet understood. Miss Marple, however, did not retire early. She sat by the fire, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed not on the room around her, but on the careful arrangement of thoughts within her mind. Every detail, every word spoken by Mrs. Blackwood, every reaction from the villagers had begun to settle into place. 3 men, 2 already dead, 1 remaining, and a past that had not stayed buried. She had seen such patterns before, not identical in form, perhaps, but in nature. Guilt had a way of lingering, of shaping behavior long after the act itself had been committed. It revealed itself in small ways, in guarded words, in sudden silences, in the subtle avoidance of certain topics. And in St. Alderwick there had been such silences. It came to her not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet certainty. The 3rd man was Mr. Arthur Penberry. He had lived in the village longer than most, a respected figure, known for his careful manner and measured speech.
He had been among those who spoke most readily of the recent deaths, offering sympathy, expressing concern, and yet never quite allowing himself to linger too long on the subject. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. If she was correct, then time was not a luxury she could afford. The following morning broke under a pale and uncertain light. A thin mist clung to the ground, softening the edges of the village and muting the sounds of early activity. It was the kind of morning that seemed to belong more to memory than to the present. Miss Marple made her way directly to Mr. Penberry's house. He answered the door himself. "Miss Marple," he said, clearly surprised, "this is unexpected." "I am afraid I must ask for a few moments of your time," she replied, her tone polite but firm. There was a brief hesitation, and then he stepped aside. "Of course," he said. "Please do come in." The interior of the house was as orderly as one might expect. Everything was in its place, every surface clean, every object arranged with care. And yet there was something in the atmosphere that felt strained, as though the order itself were being maintained with effort. Miss Marple did not sit. "Mr. Penberry," she said gently, "I believe you are in danger." He gave a small, dismissive laugh, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, "I assure you I am quite well." "I do not doubt your health. It is not your heart that concerns me." The words had the desired effect. His expression shifted just slightly. "I am not sure I follow," he said. Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "You were acquainted with Mr. Finch and Mr. Grayson," she said. "Yes, of course. We have all known each other for years." "And before that?" she asked. There was a pause. "I do not see what relevance—" "You knew them before you came to St. Alderwick," Miss Marple continued, her voice still calm, but now carrying a quiet authority. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was heavy and unmistakable. Mr. Penberry turned away slightly, his hand resting on the back of a chair. "I think," he said carefully, "that you have been listening to far too much village talk." Miss Marple shook her head. "No," she said softly, "I have been listening to what is not said." He did not respond. "And there is very little said about the years before the three of you arrived here. That in itself is rather telling." His grip on the chair tightened. "I will not entertain this," he said. Miss Marple took a small step forward. "You should," she said, "because someone else already has." At this, he looked at her sharply. "The widow," she said, "Mrs. Blackwood." A flicker of recognition passed across his face, followed by something darker. "She spoke to you," Miss Marple went on, "as she spoke to the others. She warned you." He said nothing. "She told you that the past would not remain buried, and you believed her." "I did not," he said quickly, too quickly. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "And yet," she said, "you have not slept well. You have avoided being alone, and this morning you hesitated before opening your own door." His composure began to crack. "You cannot possibly know—" "I know enough," Miss Marple said gently, "but I would prefer to hear it from you." There was a long silence, and then, slowly, Mr. Penberry sank into the chair behind him. "It was many years ago," he said, his voice low, "in a different town. We were younger then, foolish, perhaps, but not what you think." Miss Marple did not interrupt. "There was a man," he continued, "a business matter, a disagreement over money. It became heated." His hands trembled slightly. "There was an accident," he said. "He fell, struck his head. It was not intended." Miss Marple's expression remained steady. "And what did you do?" she asked. Penberry closed his eyes briefly. "We panicked," he said. We believed no one would understand, that we would be blamed no matter the truth. And so? We hid it, he said. We made it appear as though he had left, disappeared, and then we left as well. The room felt very still. "And the man?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Penberry's voice dropped to a whisper. "He died," he said. There was no need for further explanation. Miss Marple let the silence settle before she spoke again. "And Mrs. Blackwood?" she said. "Who is she?" Penberry's eyes opened, filled now with something unmistakable. "His wife," he said. The truth, once spoken, seemed to change the air itself. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "She has come for justice," she said. "Yes, and we deserve it." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "Do you believe that your friends died of natural causes?" she asked. He hesitated. "I do not know," he admitted. Miss Marple turned toward the door. "Then we must find out," she said. They arrived at Hawthorne Cottage just as the mist began to lift. The door stood slightly open. Miss Marple exchanged a brief glance with Mr. Penberry before stepping inside. The cottage was as still as before, but there was a difference now, a sense that something had reached its conclusion. Mrs. Blackwood sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed not on the room around her, but on the careful arrangement of thoughts within her mind. Every detail, every word spoken by Mrs. Blackwood, every reaction from the villagers had begun to settle into place. "No," she replied, "it is time for the truth." Mrs. Blackwood's gaze shifted to Mr. Penberry. "He has told you," she said. "He has," Miss Marple confirmed. There was a pause, and then the widow spoke again. "I warned them. I gave them the chance to face what they had done." "And did you kill them?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but direct. She held her gaze. "No," she said. The answer came without hesitation. "They died of fear," she continued, "of guilt, of the knowledge that what they had buried had finally come to claim them." Miss Marple considered this. "And you expected the same of Mr. Penberry?" "Yes," Mrs. Blackwood replied. Mr. Penberry stepped forward, his voice unsteady. "I am ready to confess, to tell the truth, whatever comes of it." For the first time, something shifted in Mrs. Blackwood's expression. The hardness softened just slightly. "That is all I wanted," she said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Then no more warnings are necessary," she said gently. The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was, at last, still. Outside, the village began to stir once more, unaware that the shadow which had hung over it had finally lifted. Justice, Miss Marple reflected, did not always arrive in the form people expected. Sometimes it came not through punishment, but through the simple, undeniable act of truth being brought into the light. And as for the widow, her warning had not been wicked at all. It had merely been necessary.